Good afternoon. My name is Bruce Jacken, and I'd like to welcome you, as well as our fellow veterans watching via Zoom at the Edith Norris Rogers Veterans Hospital in Bedford. The presentation today marks the 20th year of recorded presentations by the Lexington Veterans Association. The first recorded presentation was on October 10th in 2006 and featured Gerald Kessler talking about the January 1968 seizure of the USS Pueblo by the North Koreans. The presentation today is The Death of Democracy in Germany After World War I by retired Navy Captain Bob Lewis. Bob served 7 years duty as a carrier-based patrol plane commander flying torpedo bombers off of the USS Intrepid, Saratoga, and Wasp. Later, as a Naval Reserve officer, he flew P-2s and P-3s and commanded a Naval Reserve unit. Bob also worked for 30 years as an engineer for the MITRE Corporation at U.S. Army Europe in Heidelberg, Germany, working to develop joint communications to integrate the communications of the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. He returned to the headquarters U.S. Army Europe in 2005 to lead the communications engineering effort for an alternate command post in Romania. Later, working at Hanscom Air Force Base, Bob was the domain technical lead for all Air Force aircraft mission planning systems. Currently, Bob is a director of the Lexington Veterans Association and serves on the boards of the Weston Historical Society, his church, and a local food pantry. Please give a warm welcome to Bob Lewis.
Just one quick comment before we begin. I noticed today that when I went into the men's room, the mirror makes me look like an old man. And I think it's defective, and Jim Ramsey agrees with me. And Jim's recommendation is just don't look at that mirror. Okay. It works for him, I guess. So do democracies fail? Yes, they do. They're actually fairly fragile. We don't really think about democracies failing, but here are three democracies that have failed. The one we're going to talk about today, the Weimar Republic, and then a later one, the Czech Republic. And that's been restored, as you know. And then Russia, Republic there failed. Now, I added the three elections, the last free good elections that these different republics had. Do they still have elections? Yes, Russia still has an election. Vladimir Putin was reelected, I think, for the 8th term in 2024. Surprisingly, he got 88% of the vote. The main opponent, and you've read about this, Alexei Navalny, he was in jail at the time, maybe on a trumped up criminal charge. And then he died several weeks before the election. He was not going to be on the ballot anyway.
Mysteriously.
Pardon?
He died mysteriously.
Yes, he did die mysteriously in prison, in a Russian prison. The opposition now suggests, if you're a Russian voter, that you distort your ballot, maybe crumple it up, or leave it blank. And in the last election, the 2024 election, there were 45% more of these blank ballots found in the ballot boxes than the election before. So people were listening to this suggestion that they submit a blank ballot as kind of an opposition. But as our friend Edith said, not going to make any difference. They're a dictatorship now. Getting rid of a dictatorship is really, really difficult. So Kaiser Wilhelm II on the right. Born during World War I, Germany was a constitutional monarchy with a strong central authority as head of the executive, which controlled the military. the chancellor was appointed by the Kaiser, and he headed the civilian branch. But of course, he was appointed serving under the Kaiser, the emperor. So he had limited power, and the parliament had limited power, as the Kaiser made all of the important decisions. Hereditary monarch. The First World War had a devastating impact on Germany. By 1918, Germany was on the brink of economic collapse, facing severe food shortages because the British Navy was halting any shipping getting into ports where the food could be offloaded. There was money, but there wasn't food available. So people were starving. Malnutrition, as you know, brings disease. There was political unrest and the military defeats. You know, there's those three sufferings of the populace of Germany, which caused political unrest. Now, 9 November 1918, amid growing protests and strikes, the Kaiser abdicated. Germany was declared a republic. So, beginning of this, we'll talk about this briefly, something called the German Revolution. Here is World War I. You remember this trench warfare. A bit miserable. There's a British soldier on the right-hand side keeping a lookout. Some of his friends are asleep, and it was wet, cold. He then got trench foot, had gas, and many of them died from the Spanish flu. And every so often they were ordered to charge against machine guns. So World War I destruction was in France and Belgium. Now, there's one interesting battle up here in Tannenberg. See where Tannenberg is? We talked briefly, that was the first battle in World War I. The Germans won handily against two large Russian armies. There's a couple of reasons why that's of interest to us. First, the German general was Hindenburg. He gained national fame because of his victories in this Battle of Tannenberg. The other reason was the Russians, using radios, didn't encrypt their radios. The Germans were able to listen, determine exactly what the Russian plans were, and take advantage of that knowledge, that intelligence, basically to move the German army from one battlefield, after defeating that Russian army, move it to another battlefield and defeat that Russian army. Tannenberg, 90,000 Russian prisoners of war. I have a picture here of the 90,000. So great prestige to the two generals, Ludendorff and Hindenburg. They become important players later on in this story. So this is the losses to the German population in World War I. Total population was 64.9 million. Military actually killed in action, 1.8 million. Military deaths of all causes, which included disease. And remember, the Spanish flu was rampant. The military deaths was 15% of the individuals in the military. 4.25 million wounded. And of course, some of them wounded by gas attacks. So they suffered terribly for the rest of their lives, some of them. The civilians also suffered a higher level of death because of the war, to some extent, because they were now malnourished, they were starving, there's no food available. So it had increased civilian deaths from hunger and disease, 0.76 million. None from bombs or so forth, because Germany was untouched. The Allied powers, that's Britain and France, the Allies, lost 4.8 million in combat, but they had a combined total population of 800.6 million people. So, the revolution, 1918, 1919. World War I was still going on. The reasons were the extreme burdens suffered by the German people during World War I. Basically, the starvation. And because the empire was losing, the economic and psychological impacts of defeat, tremendous burden on the German psyche to believe that they had lost the war. There's also social tensions between the general populace and the aristocratic and bourgeois elite. Some people were making money on it, and some people were starving. So it was a revolution. It started the sailors mutinying in Kiel, not being paid and for having their families back home, starving. And then spread. Strikes. So the result of the revolution, and at the end of the revolution, was when there was a proclamation of the Republic that took place in Berlin on 9 November 1918 in front of the Reichstag. Reichstag is the building where the Parliament met, their Congress. But keep this Reichstag building and the importance of it in mind, because it plays a really important role here in a minute. The dates here, 9 November 1918. These dates are important because we want to know who gets blamed for the problems of the Versailles Treaty. It wasn't the Kaiser who gets blamed, and we'll know in a minute who does get blamed. So, 9 November, Weimar Republic was formed, the Kaiser abdicated, so we had now a constitutional republic, the first in German history. And it was quite a democracy. You'll learn that here also in just a second. So now, 2 days later, there was an armistice. It was the end of the fighting. That's what the armistice meant. End of the fighting. Not the treaty, but it's the end of the fighting. End of World War I fighting. So Germany was exhausted. So now, notice that 28 June 1919. Time for all of the folks such as the President of the United States to gather in Versailles to discuss the Versailles Treaty. Long time between the armistice and the Versailles Treaty. And it established peace terms between Germany and the Allied powers. So, the Weimar Republic. All adult Germans gained the right to vote, including women, for the first time. The president was elected by the people rather than being a hereditary monarch. Civil rights such as freedom of speech and equality before the law were guaranteed in the Constitution. Freedom of speech. Keep that one in mind, as later we find that was eliminated. Anybody that protested, folks called dissidents, they were arrested, so they couldn't basically protest any longer. I'll go on with that one. Okay, so now, and then we had proportional representation in the Reichstag. It's ensured with all the different states in Germany had a proportional representatives in the Reichstag. That's ensured a wide range of political views were represented in the Reichstag. Now, here we have a republic. What were the conditions in Germany that led to Hitler's rise in power in Germany? These included a lot of the Germans didn't think they'd really lost the war. A lot of the soldiers in the trenches didn't realize that the country was losing. And they were frustration over the losses. In the treaty, they lost all of their colonies, for example. They lost a section called the Alsace-Lorraine, which was west of the Rhine, became part of France. They lost part of Prussia to Poland. Then there was an economic depression that started in the United States, caused basically industrial production in Germany to really, really slow down. People weren't buying stuff. We had a U.S. tariff, basically, that made German products less attractive to be purchased in the United States. So, of course, that further depressed the economy in Germany because they weren't selling stuff to the U.S. anymore. So, of course, what the standard industrialists would do, it laid off people. And, of course, once you have unemployment now, you have people that can't afford to pay their mortgage. They can't afford to pay for food. So now there was plenty of food available, but there wasn't enough money to pay for it. And you had a populace, the people of Germany, willing to embrace false arguments that the causes of their problems were the Weimar Republic politicians, because they had signed the Treaty of Versailles, Jews, and communists were to blame for all these problems. That real communist phobia developed, that anti-Semitism, that racism, and you had fanatic nationalism. And you had a scapegoat. You had the Weimar Republic to blame for all the problems. Now, let's take a look at the map of Europe before World War I. Notice the absence of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia as independent countries. Austria-Hungary was, of course, huge. An interesting story, at least I think it's interesting. My great-grandfather was a soldier, the emperor of Austria-Hungary. He was wounded, and there was a policy of the emperor, if you were wounded in one of his campaigns, he would give you a tobacco shop, because tobacco was a monopoly in Austria. So you could, in fact, earn a living for you and your family because your neighbors had to come to you. Limited number of tobacco shops in the country, so it was a kind of a guaranteed income, even if you were blind, even if you had lost a limb. So, by the way, that tobacco shop is still there. Yeah, and I've met some of my relatives over there. My great-grandfather was married 3 times, and the relatives are kind of catty because they say that the last woman who married my great-grandfather, she did it just for his tobacco shop. So, where's the Ukraine? Okay, here's after World War I. You have Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia emerge. See up there in the upper right-hand corner, you see Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia as independent countries. Pretty remarkable changes. So the Treaty of Versailles marked the end of World War I between Germany and the Allied powers. And here are the main conditions of the treaty. Territorial losses, including all of the German colonies, had military restrictions, including demilitarizing an area in Germany was called the Rhineland. I'll have a map of that in a minute. The reason was because Germany had invaded the Low Countries, Belgium and Holland, sweeping through the area of Germany called the Rhineland. In the Treaty of Versailles, there was a war guilt clause, which Germany representatives accepted all responsibility for the war. Then we had huge reparations for damages inflicted in France and Belgium, civilian damages. $950 billion in 2025 dollars. $950 billion is what was agreed upon as being owed by Germany to the countries where destruction happened. Then you had the dismantling of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The terms were highly controversial and contributed to economic hardship and political instability in Germany. Some historians say that Germany could have easily paid the $950 billion, but they didn't have the political will to do so. They didn't want to raise taxes that would make the Weimar Republic even less attractive, less stable. So they basically stalled on paying. That caused problems too. Terms were highly controversial and contributed to the economic hardship and political instability in Germany. Here we have the Central Powers, just might like to look at these guys. So we have Kaiser Wilhelm, Kaiser and King Franz Joseph of Austro-Hungary, and the Sultan Muhammad V of Ottoman Empire, and they have Tsar Ferdinand of Bulgaria. These were the fellows that basically lost in World War I. Here's the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 14. Can you see the Rhineland now? Rhineland Palatinate. The winners of the war, of course, didn't want Germany invading them again. So they said, okay, we'll demilitarize this. Germany can't put any forces in here, and that's to increase our security against future German aggressions. It was a good idea. Didn't work. World War II, the Germans used the same lowlands to swing it around the Maginot Line to get to Paris. Here's Alsace-Lorraine, the west of the Rhine. It has swapped sides between France and Germany a couple of times. Now it's still French. Now, Weimar Republic faced numerous challenges that ultimately led to its failure. It had economic instability, had what they called hyperinflation. I think politicians like inflation because it means they have to pay off their debt with cheaper money. But the inflation in Weimar Republic was outrageous. You had political fragmentation. You had social unrest. You had weakness of democratic institutions, loss of public support. And then you had the Great Depression of 29, where unemployment went up to 30% in Germany, and loans from the U.S. were halted, and U.S. tariffs were imposed. So now Bavaria. It's a beautiful area of Germany, southern Germany. It's famous for basically, it's true today. If you go to Bavaria and ask someone, what are they? Where are they from? They'll say, I'm a Bavarian. They won't say I'm a German. German is kind of second. So famous for traditional separatism and the region's popular dislike of the Republican government in Berlin. So that's where Hitler decided he was going to start his march on Berlin, just like Mussolini had started his march on Rome. So Munich, as the Bavarian center, was a gathering place for dissatisfied service members and soldiers that were unwilling to return to civilian life, and were political plotters against the old republic, political plotters such as Adolf Hitler. Now, he had a run on the bank during the hyperinflation crisis in the Weimar Republic. People, presumably trying to get their money out so that they could buy something solid that they could later either sell or eat. Because the hyperinflation picture some kids playing with blocks of paper marks. Germany tried to pay the reparations using these cheap paper marks, and France and Belgium rejected this idea because the money was worthless, and they wanted their 650 million. So they basically, with their soldiers, reoccupied the Ruhr Valley, which is a very important industrial area, so that they could take steel and coal rather than these miserable paper marks. So had the extreme devaluation of the Reichsmarks, such as a loaf of bread costing 200 billion marks by the end of the year. So inexpensive, so worthless that you have kids here playing with blocks of these things. And the inflation was such, they eventually had to pay workers twice a day so that they could go at noon and buy bread before it doubled in price. So what does this do to you? What effect does this kind of inflation have on you? What does it do to your 401k overnight? The money that you save for years, makes your savings worthless. So of course it causes hoarding. It's one of the behaviors, right? You're going to buy whatever bread you can buy today, whatever you can afford today, you're going to buy, because tomorrow it's going to be twice as much. And the other thing it causes basically people going to bartering, where people would trade labor for a bag of potatoes or something. I'll come and paint your house if you give me 200 pounds of potatoes or something like so. People left using the currencies, as you can imagine they would. And of course, people that are trying to rent property to people, their rent is set at 2,000 marks a month, and now 2,000 marks is absolutely worthless. So it hurt people in many, many different ways. And I'm sure that putting money in the bank to save was probably completely eliminated savings. So 200 billion marks by the end of the year. You wouldn't even want to go to work anymore. You'd say, "Oh, I'm gonna make my own bread, or I'm gonna go fishing, or something." So here we have a beer hall in Munich called the Burger Brau Keller. Burger Roy Keller. And a burger is a citizen. So beer halls in Munich, noisy, happy people drinking and with their friends and eating good food, even to this day in Munich. So this is called the beer hall putsch. 8 November 1923. Hitler basically, because it was so noisy in there, he climbed up on a chair and fired a pistol into the ceiling to get everyone to quiet down. And then he told them that the existing Bavarian government had been deposed. Now, he held the chief of police of Munich and a few prominent politicians at gunpoint while he was talking about the end of the existing Bavarian government. But their loyalty to him ended rather rapidly as soon as he put the pistol away, as you would expect. But it's a failed coup d'etat by the party leader, Adolf Hitler. He wanted to lead a march of Nazis. So during a march the next day, approximately 3,000 Nazis were met by police gunfire, and 14 Nazis were killed, and 2 policemen were killed when the Nazis returned fire. So Hitler fled, but was found and convicted of treason. His prison sentence was really light because, at least some historians say, because the judge was really kind of in favor of the end of the Weimar Republic and liked Hitler's talks. So here's Marienplatz, Munich. Hitler was arrested and convicted of treason. His trial was widely publicized, but now he had a national name. Hitler was brought to the attention of the German nation because of this audacious act. Now, since the 5 years, during this time, he had time to reflect and wrote his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, while in prison, laying out what he thought was important, what his plan was. After the failure of the treasonous beer hall putsch, Hitler concluded that he should devote his efforts to legal approaches to taking over the government rather than violence, using weapons and guns and so forth. So he's going to go for legal approaches. Now, something to note about Hitler, he was a hardworking, very, very smart individual. He had his own photographer. Here he is practicing his gestures before a speech, and he practiced his talks. And he was a very powerful speaker. And his photographer took lots of fine photographs, and they were used in his propaganda throughout the nation. He tapped into the anger and helplessness felt by a large number of voters, and he attracted a wide following of Germans desperate for a change. And it's easy to understand why people were desperate for a change. The economy was collapsing. The savings were gone. He carefully tailored his speeches to his audiences. He dressed in fine suits, and he practiced, and he worked hard, and he had different speeches for different audiences. So, anti-Semitism, racism, ultranationalism were central tenets of the Nazi ideology. So in their 25-point party program published in 1920, Nazi party leaders publicly declared their intentions to segregate Jews from Aryan society and to abrogate their political, legal, and civil rights. Their plan was to actually pay for some of their activities, building up the army, building up the Navy, building up the Air Force, by using money gained from basically stealing the property of Jews. So in the first 6 years of the Nazi regime, 33 to 99, 33 to 39, more 400 legal restrictions were imposed on Jews and other groups. They were not the only groups. They're not the only groups. Now, here's a bit of mythology, basically misinformation, that the German army lost World War I because the army had been stabbed in the back. It was important because it gave the Nazis scapegoats. So here is a Jew stabbing a German soldier in the back with a dagger. So the capitulation, in other words, the capitulation of the Central Powers was blamed on communists, Bolsheviks, and the Weimar Republic, but in particular on Jews. This was totally false. There were many, many, many Jewish soldiers that died in the German World War I army, and they served as doctors and so forth as well. So it was just a myth, but it was a popular myth. So Hitler slowly rose up in the number of votes that he got in each election. So here in 1933, Hindenburg, now president, he was the general at Tannenberg. He appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Now, the hope was among individuals at Hindenburg's level was that they could co-opt Hitler's influence and neutralize his extreme beliefs, extreme behaviors, neutralize it, co-opt it, take advantage of Hitler's popularity for their causes. Notice here we have the Nazi Party here, NSDAP. The general election, They got 2.6% of the votes. September 1930. 9 times as many. So what was happening in the world during that time period? 1929, the economy was collapsing, Great Recession, Great Depression. And the worse off the economy is, the more popular is a man who says, I can solve all these problems for you, just vote for me. This government's failing. You gotta have a change. Notice that Hitler never had a majority. So he had to form coalitions with the National People's Party. But you can see what happened during the Depression. Now, we had an incident when the Reichstag burned down. 27th February 1933. Things happened really fast here. This is the end of February. By March, the Nazis had the first concentration camp. So things happened really quickly. This was 4 weeks after Hitler was sworn in as chancellor. Hitler showed up at the fire in his limousine and declared this was the act of the communists. The Nazis immediately attributed the fire to a group of communist agitators and used the fire as a pretext to claim that the communists were plotting against the German government. And Hitler got the president to issue the Reichstag fire decree suspending civil liberties. You hear this idea of an emergency. We have an emergency. We have to have a strong man. We can't use the Constitution anymore because the Reichstag moves too slowly. Parliament moves too slowly. Congress moves too slowly. You be alert to people declaring emergencies as a means of suspending civil liberties. The interior of the Reichstag burned out. So the Reichstag fire decree of the next day, suspended constitutional guarantees. Communist and socialist deputies were expelled from the parliament, even though they had been legally elected to the parliament. They were expelled because of the decree. Shortly after the decree was issued, Nazis established concentration camp, the first one being Dachau, for the internment of political opponents, dissidents, political opponents, not Jews. So they started with political opponents. So the elections now, March of 33, right? The fire was in February 33. Elections in March 33 did not yield a Nazi majority, so Hitler had to rely on his coalition partner, the German National People's Party, to command a majority in Reichstag. And at the Reichstag session, Hitler introduced the Enabling Act of 33, which is one again. So we have an emergency here. The communists are trying to take over. We need to give me the authority to make laws, even unconstitutional laws. By the end of the summer, the only legal party was the Nazi Party, by way of a formal ban on opposition parties. July 14, 1933, the law against the formation of parties. Isn't that outrageous? The Reichstag voted on a law against the formation of opposition parties or any parties? Okay. 33 Dachau established, first political prisoners, German communists, the Social Democrats, dissenters, right? People opposing the Nazis, dissenters, not criminals, and other political opponents, trade unionists of the Nazi regime. If you go to Dachau, I've been there twice. The first time was just foreign tourists like you and I. The second time, 10 years later, German school bus groups. So it's now a required part of the German middle school curriculum for German kids to visit a concentration camp to basically face their history and maybe learn from it. So first political prisoners, later the racism showed its face. Since you had the Romas, basically gypsies, you had gay men, you had black men, and you had Jehovah's Witnesses. Why Jehovah's Witnesses? They refused to take the oath of loyalty to Hitler, refused to serve in the German army, refused to give the Nazi salute, refused to have their kids join the Hitler Youth. Basically dissenters. No crime, right? No crime, just dissenters. Refused to go along with it. Now, Kristallnacht, 1938. Remember what Kristallnacht was? It's basically all across Germany, armed thugs working for Hitler destroyed synagogues and destroyed, and of course, there's a lot of glass, broken glass on the sidewalks. And that was where the crystal, and Nacht is night, crystal. So you had a lot of broken glass on the street. And of course, German enterprises, German businesses were attacked and destroyed, sabotaged, burned. And that's still called Kristallnacht to this day. But it was after Kristallnacht, 1938, that Jews became the focus of the concentration camps. Now, this is one of the more outrageous, the Night of the Long Knives. He had two paramilitary organizations, the SA and the SS. You've heard of the SS. But Hitler ordered a violent purge of the top leadership of the Nazi Party, paramilitary organization, the SA. These are people that had worked for him as thugs, doing the Kristallnacht behaviors and that sort of thing. He directed the SS to murder several conservative critics of the Nazi regime, including Hitler's predecessor as chancellor. Just unbelievable. He ordered the murder of his predecessor. So now, 34, President Hindenburg died. Now, 2 days before, they passed a law on the head of state of the German Reich. That's the name of the law. Came into effect, which combined the offices of chancellor and president. And Hitler became the absolute dictator of Germany at that point. He became Der Führer, which means guide, and the Reichskanzler. So, in Nazi Germany, a civil service system provided legal framework to deprive residents, particularly Jews, of their rights. So, if you did not join the National Socialist League for the maintenance of law, they were dismissed. And of course, here we know what losing a job means. You can't buy shoes for your kids, you can't buy food for your family, you can't pay the mortgage. So careers are really, really important and really powerful tool. If some guy says, I'm going to snatch away your job if you don't join my group, my National Socialist. So increasingly controlled by the Nazi, it was the judiciary. It's lost its independence. So Jewish lawyers and judges and those with socialist views inconvenient to the Nazi Party were removed. Couldn't be a Jewish lawyer, couldn't be a Jewish judge any longer, because it was inconvenient, not because he would commit any kind of a crime. That was propaganda at the early Nazi rallies. This is an amphitheater still here today in Heidelberg, Germany. It's built 1934, along with 35 others like it around Germany. So this is where they had the rallies, Nazi rallies. They had them at night. Young men carrying down the sides massive torches, big drums, huge Nazi flags with spotlights on them. It's a very rousing kind of a rally. Oh, if you're standing in the gravel there in the center today, you can, and you have somebody listening way up here in the stands, you can hear the person's feet crunch on the gravel. That's how good the sound quality is. And of course, the speakers, the main Nazi speakers, that would come out those doors there to make their presentation, and the guys with the flags and the giant torches would walk up on either side to make a very colorful assembly in the dark of the night. Looking up the amphitheater, you see booths that had projection of spotlights and so forth. And so it was state of the art with amplification like it was then, spotlights still there. The acoustics are really amazing. I went to a Beethoven concert here. So here's some anti-Semitic legislation. Government at every level, country level, state level, town level, city level, adopted hundreds of laws, decrees, directives, guidelines, and increasingly restricted the civil and human rights of Jews in Germany. Jews were allowed to leave, and of course, they did. Oh. Here's some laws that deprive people of their civil rights. First major law was the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Excluded Jews and politically unreliable from civil service, could no longer work for the government. Now, 33 Decree of Berlin, no longer national law, but city law for Berlin, suspended Jewish doctors. They could no longer work the city's social welfare services. You had prohibitions against people getting a PhD. You had prohibitions against university professors who were being Jewish. Right? But what do you think that did? You think the university professors were, now they're out of a job. How are they going to pay for their kids' shoes? So of course they left. And that was a huge loss. You can imagine what a huge loss if some of your best college professors have left. And Germany was famous for being basically way ahead in chemistry during this time period. My dad was a chemist studying in Colorado, and he had to study a lot of German because a lot of the chemistry texts were in German. The law on the admission to the legal profession forbids the admission of Jews to the bar. So, but it was a huge, dramatically inefficient mistake on the part of Nazi Germany to basically tell their finest professors in the sciences, you can't be a professor here anymore. And that was their career. And now they basically had to look elsewhere for work. I think they also saw the handwriting on the wall. It might get worse for Jews. They wanted to leave before started any more severe punishments. But here we have one of the, perhaps the most famous German Jewish physicist, Albert Einstein, with a letter. He was living in Long Island. You can see from the upper right hand, living in Long Island. He writes a letter to FDR. FDR read it, and he basically says, this basically sustained nuclear reactions may be able to be transformed into some incredibly huge, powerful weapons, and really ought to be followed closely. You should become aware of this, Mr. President. Albert Einstein. It wasn't long after this before the Air Force attacked the hydroelectric plant in Norway that was making heavy water for the German nuclear bomb effort. But here's Albert Einstein. He would have served the Third Reich. Here he's serving the United States. So what was the impact of this disastrous anti-Semitism, racism, and ultranationalism? Berlin. Another picture of what happened in Berlin. So could it happen here? Could it happen here? Do we have anti-Semitism here? This is a Nazi rally in New York City, Madison Square Garden, February 20, 1939. I think the answer is that we did have anti-Semitism here. 25,000 attended this Nazi rally. I circled the Nazi flags to highlight them, the yellow circle. And then, of course, who's the fellow standing in the middle? Yeah, George Washington. So you have the stormtroopers here standing guard. Here's the George Washington again, once again, Madison Square Garden. So now, how did the legal system in Germany enable the deprivation of the rights of Jews and Romas and the Jehovah's Witnesses? Oh, one thing I forgot to mention. In Dachau, there's a plaque that says 2,000 Catholic priests were imprisoned there for speaking up, for being dissidents against what was happening. 2,000 Catholic priests. So it was well beyond Jews. It was Romans. It was Soviet prisoners of war that were imprisoned and murdered. So, pardon?
Bonhoeffer.
Yeah. So how could state-sponsored and legalized evil be permitted in a highly educated, civilized country in the 20th century? And I always say, these people learned the golden rule. They knew they were supposed to treat strangers as they would want to be treated. So what in the world happened? Adolf Hitler's absolute power as a dictator was achieved incrementally, in plain sight, and under the law, using elections and laws. So be wary. Book I recommend, Eternal Vigilance. Excuse me, it's the one on the lower paragraphs. Timothy Snyder on Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, where he outlines 20 lessons on tyranny. Now, human nature is such that American democracy must be defended not from external sources, but from Americans who would exploit its freedoms, bring about its end, just as Hitler exploited the freedoms of the Weimar Republic to bring about its ends. Are there any questions or any comments? No, thank you.
Jim, are you going to be my partner?
Yeah.
Or is Bruce? Okay, I'll take this part of the room and
Turn it on for
Jim
me.
this part.
Turn it on.
All right, well, you want me to turn it on for you?
I think you have to take your.
I've got a microphone.
Okay, looks like Bill's gonna have the first question. So for anyone who wants to ask a question, we will hand you the mic. Please speak into the mic when it is your turn, okay? Go, Bill.
Bob gave us a 4-year course on European history, and we're all the beneficiary thereby. I lived behind the Iron Curtain many years, mostly in Czechoslovakia, in Europe from 1932 on. My one point I'd like to make, Bob, is that the Soviets stopped their activities on the Eastern Front on the 22nd of October of 1917. What happened? Lenin decided that he wasn't going to fight anymore, and they stopped fighting. The Germans were delighted. They didn't have to fight the Russians. The West was not terribly happy because the Germans moved all their troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. That polluted the feelings by the West toward Russia to this day. But the Germans felt very strongly that the Russians stabbed them in the back, and that has changed events in Eastern and Western Europe to this day. Thank you again, Bob.
You're welcome. Bill?
Bob, you named the different things that the German people blamed on their conditions. But the Weimar Republic, why did they accept such ridiculous terms? And I never could understand this. I've heard this before. Why did Germany accept total responsibility for a war that had how many countries involved in it? Why would I point to them? My question.
As you know, is the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand. Not in Germany, but they had the coalitions, all the treaties intertangled. So when one country went to war, the other countries went in their support. I think the reason the terms were accepted is because they didn't want the war to continue. They were losing the war. They lost over 1 million men. I think they wanted to end the war. So, Edith, do you have a thought? Yeah.
In Sarajevo, where the prince was assassinated, really led the Austrians to insist that the Germans follow the treaty. Initially, at least the Germans did not want to join the Austrians, but they were forced by treaty. And the other reason in terms of why did Weimar accept it, when you're the loser, you have nothing to say in terms of what's being dictated to you. So the terms, which were unreasonable and did lay part of the foundation for World War II, I don't think the Germans had anything to say about it. I mean, they were at the losing end and the winners dictate. Simple.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Edith.
Next question. Jim?
Thank you. Yes. I wonder if you could comment on the role of the German military during the 1930s, during the rise of Hitler.
Well, Hitler was spending a great deal of money on the army, expanding it from 100,000, which was the limit in the Versailles Treaty, up to over 300,000, and building ships, building airports, because he was saying this is going to be civil aviation. That's why we're building all these airports, why we're building all these airplanes and airplane factories. So the military was on board. So was the military industrial complex, because they were making airplanes, they were making tanks, they were making trucks. Remember, Henry Ford had a big truck plant there in Germany. So they were absolutely on board with the buildup. They wanted a huge army. They had been humiliated. They wanted revenge. They wanted their prestige brought back up. All those answers. So they were on board with the buildup, and Hitler was the one who was funding the buildup.
At what point did the staff of the German military, I think it's von Stauffenberg, and I believe there were others, at what point was there actual resistance to Hitler from high-ranking military people?
I think it was after World War II started, right? It's after they started to suffer tremendously failures in World War II. That was quite a few years later.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, after they started invading France and the Low Countries and started, attacking Russia and started attacking Great Britain from. Yeah, that was later after they started to lose. That wasn't, of course, the military industrial complex. That was the military personnel themselves that said this isn't going well.
We have a question from one of our Zoom viewers. Libby?
So Stephen says, my father, a Vienna native, always maintained that the Allies made a huge error in breaking up Austria, but not Germany.
By not breaking up.
He says it made a huge error in breaking up Austria, but not Germany.
Well, interesting. That basically, Austria was in fact broken up, just like Berlin was broken up, and Germany was broken up, East and West Germany. But you had the French sector, you had the American sector, the British sector in Berlin, but you had the same thing in Vienna. So it was broken up, I think.
It didn't work.
Yeah, it's not World War One. Austria wasn't broken up.
Yes, it was.
He said
Not after-
post-World
After
War
World War I.
Yeah.
Well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's what he was referring to.
Yeah, he said post-World War One.
Right.
Okay, we're talking about Austro-Hungary Empire. And the truth is that Germany lost its colonies, it's lost the Alsace-Lorraine, it was, and lost Czechoslovakia, it lost Poland, so it was broken up.
Am I being heard?
Yes.
I raised,
Go ahead.
Hi.
referring to post-World War I, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up, Germany lost its colonies and some territory, but it remained one large country and became powerful again. And that is the point that my father was making, that Austria was no longer a counterweight to Germany after World War I.
So, but Austria was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
But it was
During World War One, you had Germany separate from the Austro-Hungarian Empire where Austria was.
Well, Austria had a treaty with the Germans in World War I
Yes, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a treaty with the
Germans.
with the Germans.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the speaker is right. I mean, Austria lost more. Austria lost it more because the entire area of Hungary and toward the east was carved off after World War II.
You're talking about Austro-Hungarian Empire, though, not Austria.
Well, Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had a great map on here.
Yeah.
Where you could see Austria, then Hungary, which was, infinitely larger than it is now.
And infinitely larger than Austria as well.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Austria is a smidgen right now.
Yeah, smidgen.
That empire was huge.
and Prussia
What
and
is now Austria is just a fraction of the empire.
Right.
Is that what you mean?
No, he spoke about World War I.
So Olga has a question for you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for invitations and wonderful hospitality. And I would like to ask you, do you see parallel with Putin's politics nowadays? And what should Ukrainians do in this situation? And if we say that if history is repeating, how do we stop in this time?
How would you
How do we stop in this time if history is repeating? And what do you think about Russian politics, again, Ukrainians, and what do you think about? Thank you.
Background about Olga, might be, if you don't mind, while you're asking the
I can
question.
describe.
Yeah, just say.
Thank you. Maybe I need to present myself. My name is Olga. I'm from Ukraine, and Bob helped me with my English. I would like to start to study in Harvard Extension School, and I need to have more speaking practice in English, and with how we meet with Bob. And I'm from Ukraine, and I'm from Kharkiv. In 24 of February 2022, me and my family was in Kharkiv, and Russian started to bomb us. Kharkiv, it's city close to Russian borders, and we were first who understood that was starved. And it's very painful. It's very painful question for me, and it's very painful question for all Ukrainians, because we understand and we see that history is repeating. Yes, and my question is, what Ukrainians must do, what Ukrainians should do in this situation? Yeah, we are very brave. We tried to save our country, but we understand that our we can't do it without, yes, we can't do it alone, and we can't do it without help. European countries and the United States. And it's a real important question for me. I would like to understand what Americans do you think about this situation, and I would very glad if you can answer me on this question. Thank you.
Well,
thank you so much for your attention.
Well, I personally think you're absolutely essential to resist. If you fold and don't resist, you can't go back. Can't go back. Once you're overwhelmed by a dictator, you don't have freedom of speech anymore. You don't have the ballot box anymore, a legitimate ballot box. So you can't change your mind once the dictator takes over. So my advice is to resist, try to get Europeans to help with armament, help with intelligence. So I think that's what they're doing. But now the other thing is that Vladimir Putin is a dictator. If you dissent against him, you get murdered or thrown in jail, thrown in prison somewhere. So that's what I think of Vladimir. There's no free, legitimate elections in Russia anymore. People don't have the right to vote anymore, the right to speak, the right to freedom of speech, press, right to basically protest, to gather and form protests. So the freedoms are gone, civil rights are gone.
And your enemies are killed.
What?
The enemies are killed.
His enemies are murdered. Exactly right. Yeah.
Anybody want to make a comment to Olga? Fred, no? Go ahead, say what you want to say.
I wanted to ask a different question. That was where languages had come into the evolution of these political countries during the 1930s. Different languages, which areas spoke different languages.
Oh, well, the French spoke French. The Austrians spoke German.
Hungarians spoke Hungarian.
Hungarians spoke Hungarian. So and of course the Brits spoke English. So the Russians spoke Russian. Does that answer your question?
The universal language was French.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Universal
At
language.
least the educated people spoke French for a while, and it wasn't until World War II that English became the language of dominance, as it is now.
Thank you, Edith. I'm glad you're here.
And the solutions that ended up respected those differences in languages?
No, I don't believe so. No, I don't. You mean the Versailles Treaty? Treaty of Versailles?
I don't remember details.
Can you repeat the question, Linda?
Fred said, are you talking about the Versailles Treaty? Were the differences in language respected? Huh? That was your question.
Did the differences in language help determine the hostilities and the willingnesses to compromise and end up with what we ended up with?
I have no knowledge or opinion on that. I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. They would all have translators, interpreters, so I would guess it had no impact. Well, thank you very much. Oh. One more question.
Yeah.
Probably not so much a question as a statement, but I'm Arthur Dolphus. I'm actually Jim's neighbor. And I served in the Army Nuclear Weapons Europe. But that's not directly relevant here. I think we had such a good presentation, a cautionary tale, I would say, of great importance.
Yes.
And you showed a slide in there about Nazis in America. That was a PBS special, which you can all get, which talks about the Nazi Party in the United States for many, many years, until 1940, when the leaders of it were quietly shoved under the rug. No investigation was done. And we just went on to become, anti-Germany and all that. Olga, my personal opinion is, looking at things, is that Ukraine is a completely different situation. It's not a democracy dying from within. It's a democracy that's frantically fighting for its life and deserves it. And it has been invaded and attacked by an outside force. And that's a difference. This one is a cautionary tale where I think we should look for analogies that might be going on around us anytime. That's what I say.
Yeah, thank you. Well put.
Jim, Roger.
Roger Borgersani. I'm a member of the Brookhaven family. One thing I want to mention that I think that was mentioned that parallels between what's happening in the United States and what's happened in the 1920s and 30s in Germany. And it's an interesting book. I've kind of read it twice. It's by Madeline Albright. It's called Fascism. And I recommend it to everybody because there's so many parallels in that book to today's administration. And it's frightening, and to how many parallels there are to what's happening with the judicial system and the democracy in this country. And I recommend the book.
Thank you.
Last chance. Final questions? One more, Harry.
Sure. One more question, Bob. I'm wondering, in your study of the 30s, were there any critical events where you think intervention from outside or something different from within would have derailed the progress to dictatorship? Any critical points there that came out in your studies?
Just a belief that the Reichstag, which was their parliament, their Congress, the individuals should have stood up and started to heavy protests against what was happening to their fellow citizens, being arrested, all the 2,000 Catholic priests, all the Jehovah's Witnesses. These people were not criminals. They were just dissenters. So as soon as they saw that the freedom of speech was being obliterated, they all should have risen up and taken to the streets. Edith?
Well, the problem was that I think the problem was that their counter activities in terms of spying networks, informants, had the nation just so intimidated that people really had difficulty speaking up because there was a hell of a price attached to speaking up, as we all saw today in the presentation. I mean, it takes a lot of bravery to stand up, and they did, and they died. So I think, one of the things we need to watch out for is our freedoms in terms of freedom of speech, our ability to voice our dissent without being arrested or punished or persecuted. Those are the keys that we have to maintain in this country and be very jealous about it and be ready to defend it.
And Edith also mentioned spies, and
Yes.
she reminded me that the one of the commissioners of the Federal Reserve is now, Trump's trying to get rid of her because years ago she had some kind of question about applying for a mortgage. So obviously people have been hired to dig into the backgrounds of dissenters and to bring them to light, even if it has nothing to do with their quality of their work, something to do with a mortgage. And so keep your eye on that kind of information too, where oddball little problems that someone did 30 years ago now suddenly come to light, so that we can eliminate that person from an important position in the government, a position that protects us. Internal spying on citizens.
Well, that's food for another program. So.
They should read 1984 by George Orwell. Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that presentation. Appreciate all your comments. I'd like to remind everybody that our next presentation will be Tuesday, October 14th, because of the October 13th Monday holiday. So Tuesday, October 14th, Mark Thompson will speak on decision-making that led to the fighting of the Falaise Gap, which in World War II in France was the breakout from Normandy. And it has a very interesting take on how those decisions were made for what forces would be committed and when the fighting would occur. And it occurs in August, 2 months after the invasion of Normandy. So hope you all join us Tuesday, October 14th, right here. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Bruce. Well done, Bruce.